Before we begin, let me ask you something. What if the darkest secrets of an emperor were never written in blood, but in numbers? Hidden inside the Roman archives exists a pattern so disturbing and so methodical that even historians today describe these documents not as records, but as warnings. Why would an empire create entire sections of its bureaucracy to catalog things no civilization should ever normalize? Keep that question in mind. We'll come back to it. Most people believe they know Caligula, the rumors, the scandals, the monstrous anecdotes repeated for centuries. But what if I told you that most of what you think you know is actually the least terrifying part? The true horror wasn't what Caligula did in private. It was what the state recorded, authorized, approved, and preserved. Why would clerks, ordinary men, quietly sign their names beneath acts that would horrify even Rome's enemies? Hold that thought as well. In the next few minutes, you will hear about patterns, not rumors or gossip, but administrative structures, in which human beings were converted into entries, fees, requisitions, and services. Which is more terrifying, a cruel man, or a system built to make his cruelty normal? You'll decide that by the end. There is a surviving provincial ledger where a single clerk wrote 3 words in the margin, almost erased by time. This is wrong. Why would he risk writing that? Why would he leave that note instead of burning it? We will uncover that too. And here is one final question before we dive deeper. What if the real story of Caligula isn't about madness at all, but about how institutions slowly adapt to serve power, bending, breaking, and reforming around the will of one man? Once you see how the machine worked, you will understand why later emperors tried to destroy these records and why they failed. If you're ready to see how desire became policy, how violence became ritual, and how silence became currency, then follow me. From this point forward, we enter the darkness the archives tried to bury. The palace at night kept its own breath. Torches guttered in long corridors. The frescoes seemed to watch, as if the painted eyes might accuse. Somewhere within the labyrinth, a scribe bent over a table of wax and ink, and the sound of his stylus on the page fell into the hush like a verdict. Outside, beyond the marble, the city slept fitfully beneath its gods. Inside, the affairs of empire were being logged with the same steadiness as grain receipts and legionary rosters. It is in those ledgers, folded, redacted, suffered into the archive, that the most unsettling accounting of power appears. Not merely what an emperor desired, but how his appetite was converted into policy, fee schedule, and official record. Before the story begins in earnest, if you find this investigation valuable, stay with it through the reconstruction that follows. Like, subscribe, and enable notifications to receive further episodes of this inquiry. The palace at night kept its own breath. Torches guttered in long corridors. The frescoes seemed to watch, as if the painted eyes might accuse. Somewhere within the labyrinth, a scribe bent over a table of wax and ink, and the sound of his stylus on the page fell into the hush like a verdict. Outside, beyond the marble, the city slept fitfully beneath its gods. Inside, the affairs of empire were being logged with the same steadiness as grain receipts and legionary rosters. It is in those ledgers, folded, redacted, suffered into the archive, that the most unsettling accounting of power appears. Not merely what an emperor desired, but how his appetite was converted into policy, fee schedule, and official record. Before the story begins in earnest, if you find this investigation valuable, stay with it through the reconstruction that follows. Like, subscribe, and enable notifications to receive further episodes of this inquiry. Your attention is the smallest counterweight to the forgetting that these records threaten to enforce. Gaius, the young emperor, once hailed for geniality and daring, carried the capital's hopes on a face that could still pass for youth. He arrived at power amid jubilation, plays and wreaths, the Senate's perfunctory acclaim, and a populace eager for a leader who would break the dry formality of imperial decorum. Yet praise can sit on the same chest as suspicion. Within 2 years, illness, an acute fever that left the emperor diminished and unpredictable, according to contemporary physicians, opened a fissure between private desire and public authority. Whether the fever altered appetite, rage, or judgment, the crucial transformation was institutional. An initial set of excesses, private or furtive, found channels into law, ritual, and the ledgers of administration. What separates anecdote from atrocity is the ledger. A private lust is a story. A scheduled service with line items and authorized witnesses is policy. The courts, the praetorian administration, the imperial household, each acquired a column in which certain human beings ceased to be singular persons and became entries. The historian's task is cruel in this era. To follow the ink, to listen for the faint recitation of a clerk reading aloud, to witness how an emperor's whim coagulated into chargeable, recorded practice. The records that survive, in fragments and later copies, read like commercial lists: the item, the fee, the witness. Redactions and euphemisms are frequent. Where words must be spoken plainly now, they were then cloaked in ritual language: service, attendance, sacral appropriation. Wherever the empire's language turned euphemistic, the effect was the same. The human cost was obscured behind bureaucracy. From the surviving traces, it is possible to distinguish 7 recurring patterns, 7 institutionalizations of sexual violence and humiliation that, together, show how one man's transgressions became a machine. The term atrocity is heavy, but it applies not to isolated deeds so much as to systems. Rule by spectacle, by coerced intimacy, by the publicization of private violation. The following are not simple allegations drawn from rumor alone. They emerge from ledger entries, private petitions preserved in the archives, the testimony of exiles, and the later annalists who, with varying agendas, copied and reinterpreted official records. Where certainty fails, the phrasing is careful. Records suggest. Archive copies list. A petition alleges. Where the archive is plain, the account is rendered plainly. The first pattern was the commodification of bodies within the household. The imperial household, its slaves, servants, and captive populations taken from the provinces, was catalogued as much for labor as for availability. In the archive's margin, a clerk's hand added notation after the usual lists of kitchen staff and litter bearers, an asterisk by certain names, a short note, redacted in later copies, marking them as admissible to the imperial presence. A petition found in a provincial archive, written by a household steward and sealed with the owner's signet, records an exchange whose language is mercantile. The transfer of serviceable persons from one domus to the emperor's possession in return for grain allotments and immunity from conscription. The petition's tone is pragmatic, even cold. The steward apologizes for the necessity of the transfer and requests compensatory payment, noting that refusal risked dishonor at the palace. For those marked in the ledger, the distinction between domestic labor and enforced availability was erased by administration. The ledger did not describe the nature of the service. It did, however, authorize the practice, quantify it, and thereby make it routine. A second pattern lay in the ritualization of violation. The emperor, eager to sacralize his presence, took to staging ceremonies where his body became, in rhetoric and literal arrangements, a site of devotion. Palace rooms were rebranded as sanctuaries. The imperial bedchamber assumed the language of a shrine.
Records of temple expenditures were rerouted to the imperial household. Carpenters who had once made altars now fashioned curtains and canopies for nocturnal gatherings. A steward's memorandum, copied into an official account, lists payments to priests for attendance to imperial mysteries, an entry that later scribes would gloss as a redistribution of religious duties. In practice, the rituals conferred a veneer of sanctity on acts that, if performed by an ordinary person, would be deemed crimes. By wrapping coercion in sacred language and placing priests as witnesses or intermediaries, the administration converted private wrongdoing into public duty. Thirdly, the emperor weaponized marriage and family to subsume the elite under his will. The archival folders contain petitions from senators, some veiled in fear, some burned in haste, that describe demands. A senator's daughter must be presented. A wife must receive the sovereign's attention as a means of testing loyalty. Marriages were rearranged at court pleasure. These were not casual affairs. The household accounts show payments to high-ranking families labeled as safeguard indemnities, some sent to mollify disgraced households whose daughters had been taken into imperial custody. One such petition, written in trembling script, pleads that the senator be allowed to keep his rank and estates in exchange for silence. The ledger bears the payment, 15,000 sesterces, dispersed by the chamberlain. Complicity and coercion became two sides of the same coin. The Senate could profit when it complied, or it could be stripped of dignity when it resisted.
The fourth pattern was the transformation of public spectacle into sanctioned violence. Triumphs, games, and the amphitheater had long been stages of domination. Prisoners paraded, exotic animals killed, mock battles arranged. Under the new order, these performances mutated. Petitions and receipts indicate that certain captives were allocated for display beyond death, brought not to the sword, but to a staged rite, recorded as part of the festival outlay. A ledger entry for the munus lists, in a clerk's small hand, payments to ushers and auditors for the maintenance of the emperor's viewing box, and an additional line, redacted in later copies, pertaining to required provisions. A chorus of witnesses later claimed that some spectacles were arranged specifically to humiliate individuals before an audience, to present them as trophies of the sovereign's will. The amphitheater thus became both instrument and theater, where the sovereign's dominance was not only asserted but made communal. Fifth, the medical offices that once advised on legitimating births and treating nobles' ailments were repurposed. Records from the medical quarter, where physicians kept notes on fevers and convalescence, include terse addenda, supply lists for imperial attendance, instructions for observation of certain persons, and authorization to draw up certificates asserting the consent of those who had been presented. A physician's marginalia, found in a bound folio of remedies, reads like a bureaucrat's note, certified for disposition. The clinical language polynomialized violation. Where once medicine might heal, it now provided cover, medicalization of consent, a forged imprimatur that permitted the household's orders to proceed with an air of legal and moral legitimacy. Sixth, and particularly chilling, was the ledgering of sexual services as a category within financial administration. The imperial fisc, the treasury ledgers, kept an account book whose columns recorded not only tribute and construction, but an oblique column of domestic provisions. Within that column, a clerk's script lists recurring disbursements to particular wards. The phrasing is bureaucratic and indirect. Compensation for attendance, allowance for maintenance of attendance. When petitions survive, they often come from the families paying these allowances, not the recipients. They protest the confiscation of kin under threat of confiscating estates. The ledger's existence is proof of calculation. These were not one-off transgressions, but scheduled, budgeted items reproducible from year to year. Money turned human beings into line items, and the empire's fiscal organs recorded them as ordinary business.
Seventh, and perhaps most corrosive to the Republic's fragile moral fabric, was the normalization of silence through reward and terror.
The archives hold correspondence between secretaries and provincial governors, advising on how to settle potential disturbances, land grants, tax rebates, and the quiet dispatch of dissidents. Rewards, offices, patronages, immunity were offered to those who complied. Punishment, exile, asset seizure, public shaming awaited those who objected. The ledger notes that certain senators received honoraria in seasons following imperial visits. The tenor of the entries suggests not generosity but purchase. Thus a system emerged that made complicity profitable and resistance ruinous. The legal architecture and the social economy together produced a culture of enforced silence. Between these administrative patterns lay innumerable human stories, each a fissure through which the machinery's cruelty showed. A senator, once outspoken, recounts in a fragmentary letter how he brought his wife to the palace because to refuse would have meant losing his right to petition and his son's future. He writes that he sat in the anteroom and heard the laughter of those who rearranged his family as if arranging textiles. A steward, in another marginal note, describes seeing a girl from the provinces made to stand in the imperial vestibule and then later listed in the household accounts under a neutral phrase. The steward's language is practical. Their conscience often appears only in the cramped space of the margin, a single line. It is not right. These intimate inscriptions are the only places where the ledger's form meets the ledger's victims. Reconstructing conversations is always fraught with danger, yet the rhythm of the archive allows reasonable imaginings. In a private chamber, a clerk reads aloud an order to a trembling noble. The emperor bids that your daughter be presented at the festival. The chamberlain will arrange matters. The senator replies in a whisper, "My daughter is betrothed." The chamberlain's pen does not pause for the rhetorical flourish of moral reply. He copies the order into the register and later seeks the necessary funds from the treasurer. The clash of human pleading and administrative calm is central to the story. Bureaucracy's indifference becomes its own cruelty. Not every enabling figure was a willing instrument. Some collaborators acted out of fear, others out of calculation, some, now and then, from simple habit. The praetorians kept watch, not only to defend the emperor, but to enforce his private will. Priests, who might have resisted the sacralization of the sovereign's bedchamber, found their roles altered and their livelihoods endangered should they refuse. Merchants who profited from supplying the palace, fine cloth, perfumes, special foods, were complicit, their ledgers intersecting with the imperial ones. Complicity was thus networked, the economy of abuse entwined with the routines of governance. Within this network, resistance brewed in small human ways. A chamberlain once slipped a petition into the hands of a senator he trusted, a single sheet in which he asked for protection, for a voice that might be heard beyond the palace walls. Conspirators formed not out of pure virtue, but from wounded honor and private vengeance. The plan that culminated in assassination drew together those who had been ruined by the emperor's demands and those who feared for the republic's remaining dignity. The conspirators met in gardens at night, under pleached trees where the air smelled of crushed herbs and distant sea salt, and planned the end not as solace for victims, though many hoped it would be, but as a means to stop the institutionalization of abuse. The killing itself is recorded with a starkness that matches its meaning. Contemporary analysts describe the scene with an emphasis on the irony of spectacle. An emperor who had made a theater of other people's bodies died in a narrow passage between columns, felled by those once obliged to salute him. The conspirators struck with decisive brutality. There is no need for lurid detail to convey the moral climax. The man whose desires had become law was now stripped of imperial pageantry. The immediate aftermath was deliberate erasure. Statues toppled, coins defaced, an official purge of some records ordered in a panic to cleanse the palace memory. Yet the ledgers, by their nature, resist complete destruction. Copies survive in provincial archives, margins preserved by clerks who deemed it safer to hide them than to burn them. If the assassination ended the man, it did not end the apparatus. The legacies were stubborn. Manuals of procedure left traces, formats for ledgers, columns to be used in inventory, ritual scripts repurposed for other courts. Children raised within the palace, instructed in the normalcy of spectacle and silence, carried forward attitudes. Some practices were overtly reversed, others were absorbed and sanitized. The Senate issued reforms, decrees that spoke of moral restoration. But reform here is often performative, a replacement of rhetoric without dismantling the networks that supported abuse. The economy that had profited from human commodification demonstrated a chilling resilience. The cultural memory of these years wavers between condemnation and forgetting. Popular songs mocked the fallen sovereign. Formal histories excoriated his tastes. Over time, official accounts emphasized depravity as individual failing, a mad emperor undone by passion, rather than structural ruin wrought by bureaucracy. That narrative choice matters because it allows institutions to appear immune. If cruelty is the attribute of one mad ruler, then the polity itself may claim innocence. But the ledgers are patient relics. The presence of those line items year after year reveals a different truth. Systems can absorb and prolong vice, giving it the force of law and the stability of practice. Symbolism threads through this history. The ledger is the central image, a blunt instrument that, inked by anonymous hands, turns persons into columns. The ledger as temple recurs. The bedchamber renamed a sanctuary. Curtains hung like tabernacles, showing how sanctity was manufactured to legitimate claim. Night and torchlight follow the patterns of secrecy. The amphitheater carries the echo of applause that once masked cries. These symbols reappear in the margins of documents and the language of petitions. The archive itself becomes a character, a witness that holds both accusation and ambiguity. A precise reckoning remains difficult because sources are partial and colored by politics. Yet the moral responsibility does not vanish under the fog of incompleteness. The records that remain show patterns: authorization and accounting, reward and penalty, ritual and routine. They show how an emperor's private appetites found instruments in the administrative organs of state: scribes, treasurers, priests, guards, who converted desire into policy. They also show the human toll: families made vulnerable, lives reduced to notations, public institutions used to silence dissent. The story ends not with closure, but with a caution. Institutions can normalize atrocity when legal and fiscal structures are turned to serve private dominion. In the months after the emperor's death, the city produced its performance of renewal. Officials publicly burned certain writs. New edicts promised protection. Yet beneath the proclamations, the ledgers quietly persisted, their formats intact, their columns waiting. The survivors, those whose names had been carelessly inked, kept to themselves, carrying shame and debts and the knowledge that the machinery could be reassembled by a future sovereign with similar appetites. The archive's final lesson is a civic one. Vigilance is the cost of memory. When records become instruments of denial, silence becomes the favored commodity of power. This reconstruction does not aim to titillate, but to indict. The 7 patterns described, commodification, ritualization, familial coercion, spectacle as violence, medical legitimation, ledgered services, and the economy of silence, are not an exhaustive catalog of every wrong committed under that reign, nor are they unchallengeable absolutes. They are, rather, the threads visible where ink has not completely faded. They show how depravity can be normalized by architecture and accountancy, how private transgression can be made public policy. They show, too, the human faces behind the entries: the senator who kept his dignity by buying silence, the steward who penned an apology in the margin, the nameless attendants listed as present in an imperial roll. To follow these traces is to accept a responsibility, to remember that brutality, when given columns and budgets, becomes durable, that the language of administration can dignify what it should condemn, and that courage must sometimes take the form of clerks who risk their posts to copy incriminating lines for safekeeping. Archives do not simply record power. They can be instruments of accountability if scholars, citizens, and guardians insist that ledger entries are more than numbers. The final scene is neither triumphant nor complete. It is a call to look at the ledgers, at the architecture of governance, and at the quiet pages where human cost is measured in margins. For those who will follow the archive further, the next step is to examine the provincial copies, the petitions tucked into private correspondence, and the marginal notations that betray conscience. Those documents are small resistances to erasure. They will be the subject of the continuing inquiry that this reconstruction initiates. Those provincial copies, when examined, begin to breathe where the central archive falls silent. A clerk in a coastal governorate, who signed with a cramped flourish and then vanished from later rolls, left a duplicate with careful erasures where names should have been. In another town, a petition was folded into a household account, its plea for mercy squeezed between measurements of grain. Marginalia, short, furious annotations, a torn corner bearing a woman's fingerprint in ink, betray the presence of hands that would not let the ledger be final. Variations in format reveal choices. Some administrators padded entries with ritual formulas to mask transfers. Others annotated with shorthand that only a few readers could decode. These traces ask different questions. Who risked copying? Whose shorthand encoded sympathy? Which household archives kept receipts like talismans against forgetting? To follow them is to move beyond the grand narratives and into the small arithmetic of survival. Petitions folded within bread accounts, names abbreviated to protect kin, cancellations noted in the same hand as a prayer. Each fragment reframes the imperial ledger not as an absolute record, but as a contested text, one in which obedience and dissent share ink. The inquiry that begins here will proceed by piecing those fragments together, listening for the voices that the columns sought to silence.